of Okinawa, 1945. In the spring of 1945, as World War II neared its end, the small island of Okinawa became the stage for one of the fiercest and bloodiest battles of the Pacific. What happened there was not just a fight for territory, it was a terrifying preview of what an invasion of Japan might cost. On April 1st, 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa in the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. At first, resistance seemed light. The beaches were taken quickly, but that calm was deceptive. Japanese forces had chosen a different strategy. Instead of defending the shoreline, they dug deep into the island's hills, caves, and fortified bunkers. What followed was nearly 3 months of relentless ground combat. American troops advanced slowly through mud, rain, and constant gunfire. Every ridge concealed machine guns. Every cave could hide snipers. Flamethrowers and grenades became tools of survival in brutal, close-quarters fighting. The island turned into a maze of smoke, shattered stone, and deafening artillery. Above the battlefield, the sky brought its own horror. Hundreds of Japanese kamikaze pilots launched desperate suicide attacks against Allied ships. They crashed explosive-filled planes directly into naval vessels, turning the ocean into a graveyard of burning steel. Dozens of ships were sunk, and thousands of sailors were killed in waves of fire and chaos. But the greatest tragedy fell upon the civilians. Okinawa was home to hundreds of thousands of people trapped between two armies. Many were forced from their homes into caves. Food ran out. Bombardment was constant. Some civilians were coerced or driven to take their own lives rather than surrender. By the battle's end, an estimated 100,000 or more Okinawan civilians were dead. When the fighting finally stopped in June 1945, the cost was staggering. Over 12,000 American soldiers were killed. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000. The island was devastated, its towns destroyed, its landscapes scarred beyond recognition. The Battle of Okinawa was more than a military victory. It showed the world how catastrophic a full invasion of mainland Japan might be. Just weeks later, atomic bombs would be dropped and the war would finally end. Okinawa remains a solemn reminder of the terrible human cost of total war, a battle where courage, desperation, and unimaginable suffering collided on a small island in the Pacific. In the summer of 1942, the city of Stalingrad stood on the banks of the Volga River. It was an important industrial city, full of factories and workers, but soon it became the center of one of the most brutal battles in history. The leader of Germany, Adolf Hitler, wanted to capture the city. It carried the name of the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, and was a symbol of pride. Hitler believed that if he took Stalingrad, he would weaken the Soviet Union and control the oil fields in the south. German forces attacked in August 1942. Bombs fell from the sky, turning buildings into ruins. Fires burned across the city. Thousands of civilians were killed. Soon, German soldiers entered the shattered streets. They expected a quick victory, but the Soviet soldiers did not give up. The fighting became close and personal. Soldiers battled for every street, every house, even every room. Factories that once made tractors now became battlefields. Snipers hid in broken buildings. The city turned into a maze of rubble and smoke. Winter came early and hard. Snow covered the ruins. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers on both sides suffered from hunger, cold, and fear. Supplies ran low. Many froze or starved. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a powerful counterattack. They attacked the weaker sides of the German army and slowly surrounded them. The German Sixth Army found itself trapped inside the ruined city. Food and ammunition were scarce. Escape became impossible. Hitler ordered his soldiers to fight to the last man. But the situation grew hopeless. Surrounded, starving, and exhausted, the German forces could no longer continue. In February 1943, the remaining German troops surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. It had lasted about 6 months. More than 2 million soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded, or captured. The city was almost completely destroyed. But the battle changed the course of the war. It was the first time a whole German army had been defeated. After Stalingrad, the Soviet Union began pushing German forces westward. The war had turned. From the ashes of the ruined city rose a powerful message. Even in the darkest winter, resistance and courage can change history. German defenses were still strong. Machine guns opened fire. Within minutes, thousands of soldiers fell. The first day of the battle became the bloodiest in British military history. Nearly 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day. Yet the battle did not end. For months, both sides continued to fight. They attacked and counterattacked. The battlefield turned into a sea of mud filled with craters from exploding shells. Rain made movement slow and painful. Soldiers lived in trenches filled with water, rats, and disease. New weapons appeared on the Somme. In September 1916, the British introduced tanks for the first time in war. The machines were slow and often broke down, but they showed that warfare was changing. By November, winter cold stopped the fighting. The Allies had advanced only a few miles. The cost was enormous. More than 1 million soldiers from all sides were killed or wounded. The Battle of the Somme did not bring a quick victory, but it weakened the German army and showed the terrible power of modern industrial war. It also changed how people saw war forever. The quiet River Somme still flows today, but the fields around it remember the courage and suffering of the soldiers who fought there. Battle of Verdun. In 1916, during World War I, one of the longest and most painful battles in history began near the French city of Verdun. The land was filled with old forts and quiet forests. Soon, it would become a place of fire and destruction. The German army planned a massive attack. Their goal was not only to capture land, but to bleed France dry. They believed the French would defend Verdun at any cost because it was a symbol of national pride. On February 21, 1916, the attack began. Thousands of German guns opened fire. Shells rained down without stopping. The ground exploded. Trees were torn apart. Villages disappeared in smoke. It felt as if the earth itself was breaking. German troops advanced and quickly captured important positions, including Fort Douaumont, one of the strongest forts in the area. France was shocked. The situation seemed desperate, but the French refused to surrender. General Philippe Pétain organized the defense. He made sure soldiers and supplies kept moving to the front using a single road known as the Sacred Way. Trucks drove day and night, bringing fresh troops into battle. The fighting became a nightmare. Soldiers lived in muddy trenches under constant artillery fire. Poison gas filled the air, machine guns and flamethrowers were used. The battlefield turned into a wasteland of craters and broken bodies. The French soldiers repeated a simple phrase, "They shall not pass." It became a symbol of their determination. For 10 months, both sides attacked again and again. Forts were lost and recaptured. Rain and cold made life even harder. By the end of 1916, the French had regained most of the lost ground. When the battle finally ended in December, more than 700,000 soldiers had been killed, wounded, or missing. Verdun became a symbol of courage and suffering. The Battle of Verdun did not change the front lines very much, but it showed the world the terrible cost of modern war and the strength of a nation determined to survive. Battle of Gettysburg. In the summer of 1863, during the American Civil War, two great armies met near the small town of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Quiet farms and rolling hills soon became the center of one of the most important battles in American history. The Confederate Army, led by General Robert E. Lee, marched north into Union territory. He hoped a victory on northern soil would weaken the Union's will to fight and possibly bring foreign support to the South. The Union Army, commanded by General George G. Meade, moved quickly to stop him. The battle began on July 1, 1863. Confederate soldiers pushed Union troops through the town of Gettysburg. The Union Army retreated to higher ground south of the town, forming a strong defensive line along hills and ridges. On the second day, fighting became even more intense. Battles raged at places like Little Round Top and the Peach Orchard. Soldiers fought bravely, sometimes hand to hand. Control of the high ground was crucial. Union troops managed to hold their positions, though losses were heavy on both sides. The third day brought the most famous moment of the battle. General Lee ordered a massive attack on the center of the Union line. Nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers marched across open fields under heavy artillery and rifle fire. This attack became known as Pickett's Charge. It was a disaster. Union guns tore through the advancing lines. Very few Confederate soldiers reached the Union position, and those who did could not break through. The attack failed, and Lee's army suffered terrible losses. On July 4th, Lee began his retreat back to the south. The Battle of Gettysburg was over. More than 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in just 3 days. It was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Gettysburg marked a turning point. After this defeat, the Confederate Army would never again launch a major invasion of the North. Months later, President Abraham Lincoln visited the battlefield and gave a short but powerful speech, the Gettysburg Address. He reminded the nation that the war was a struggle for freedom and equality. Today, the fields of Gettysburg are peaceful again, but they still remember the courage, sacrifice, and sorrow of those 3 days in 1863. The battle began on October 16th. Around 600,000 soldiers were involved. Cannons roared across fields and villages. Smoke covered the sky. The ground shook under the weight of marching troops and charging cavalry. At first, Napoleon tried to break the Allied lines with strong attacks. He was still a brilliant commander. But this time, he faced enemies who had learned from past defeats. They were united and determined. For 3 days, fighting continued without rest. Villages were captured and recaptured. Rivers and bridges became deadly traps. Many soldiers were young and frightened, far from home. On October 18th, the Allies launched a massive attack from all sides. Napoleon's army was slowly pushed back toward Leipzig. He realized he could not win. On October 19th, French forces began to retreat. During the withdrawal, a bridge over the Elster River was blown up too early, trapping thousands of French soldiers. Many were captured or killed. The defeat at Leipzig was a turning point. Napoleon lost much of his army and control over Germany. Within a year, the Allied armies would march into Paris. The Battle of Leipzig showed that even the most powerful ruler can fall when nations unite. Today, a huge monument in Leipzig remembers the courage and sacrifice of the hundreds of thousands who fought in the Battle of Nations. Battle of Kursk. In the summer of 1943, during World War II, one of the largest battles in history began near the city of Kursk in the Soviet Union. It would become the greatest tank battle ever fought. After their defeat at Battle of Stalingrad, German forces led by Adolf Hitler wanted to regain control of the Eastern Front. The plan was called Operation Citadel. The goal was to surround and destroy Soviet forces near Kursk. But the Soviets knew the attack was coming. For months, they built deep defensive lines. They placed mines in the fields, dug long trenches, and prepared thousands of anti-tank guns. Soldiers waited patiently. On July 5, 1943, the German attack began. Tanks rolled forward across open land. Among them were powerful new Tiger and Panther tanks. The ground shook under their weight. However, the Germans quickly met strong resistance. Minefields exploded. Soviet artillery fired without stopping. The fighting was intense and chaotic. The most famous clash happened near Prokhorovka on July 12th. Hundreds of German and Soviet tanks fought at close range. Smoke, fire, and dust covered the battlefield. Crews could see the enemy just meters away. After days of heavy losses, the German attack slowed. At the same time, Soviet forces launched their own counteroffensives. The Red Army pushed forward on several fronts. Hitler finally ordered his troops to stop the attack. Germany no longer had enough strength to continue. The Battle of Kursk was over by August 1943. It marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, the German army remained on the defensive for the rest of the war. The battle showed the power of preparation and determination. It also proved that the Soviet Union had gained the strength to defeat one of the most powerful armies in the world. Siege of Leningrad. In September 1941, during World War II, German forces surrounded the Soviet city of Leningrad. The attack was ordered by Adolf Hitler, who wanted to destroy the city and break Soviet spirit. Instead of capturing it directly, the German army decided to starve it. The siege would last almost 900 days. Leningrad was a beautiful and important city, full of history, culture, and factories. When the enemy closed in, nearly 3 million people were trapped inside, including hundreds of thousands of children. Food quickly became scarce. In the first winter, rations were extremely small. People received only a few pieces of bread a day. Many were weak from hunger. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was one of the coldest in history. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. There was no heating, little electricity, and almost no fuel. Thousands of civilians died from starvation, cold, and disease. Yet the city did not surrender. The only connection to the outside world was across Lake Ladoga. In winter, when the lake froze, trucks drove over the ice to bring food and supplies. This dangerous route was called the Road of Life. Drivers risked bombing and thin ice to keep the city alive. Despite hunger and fear, factories continued to produce weapons. Musicians even performed concerts to lift people's spirits. The citizens of Leningrad showed incredible courage. In January 1943, Soviet forces managed to open a narrow land corridor to the city. Finally, in January 1944, the siege was completely lifted. More than 1 million civilians died during the blockade. It was one of the deadliest sieges in history. The siege of Leningrad became a symbol of endurance and sacrifice. The city suffered greatly, but it never gave up. Battle of Borodino. In September 1812, during Napoleon's invasion of Russia, two massive armies met near the small village of Borodino, west of Moscow. It would become one of the bloodiest single-day battles of the 19th century. On one side stood the army of Napoleon Bonaparte. He had already conquered much of Europe and now marched deep into Russia with his Grand Army. On the other side was the Russian army, led by General Mikhail Kutuzov, determined to defend the road to Moscow. On September 7, 1812, the battle began at dawn. Cannons thundered across the fields. Smoke covered the sky. The fighting centered around strong Russian defensive positions made of earth and wood. French soldiers attacked again and again. They captured key positions, including the Great Redoubt, after fierce combat. The ground was covered with wounded and fallen soldiers. Both sides showed great bravery, but the cost was terrible. By evening, the Russians slowly withdrew from the battlefield. Napoleon had won the field, but it was not a clear victory. His army suffered enormous losses and was far from home. A few days later, Napoleon entered Moscow. However, the city was mostly empty and soon caught fire. Without enough supplies and with winter approaching, Napoleon was forced to retreat. The Battle of Borodino did not destroy the Russian army. Instead, it weakened Napoleon's forces before the harsh Russian winter. More than 70,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in just one day. Borodino became a symbol of courage and sacrifice for both nations, and a turning point in Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia. Battle of Waterloo. In June 1815, near the village of Waterloo in present-day Belgium, one final battle decided the fate of Europe. Just months earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte had escaped from exile and returned to power in France. Many European nations feared his return. Britain, Prussia, and their allies quickly formed an army to stop him. On June 18th, Napoleon faced two main opponents, the British-led army under Arthur Wellesley and the Prussian army led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The battle began late in the morning after heavy rain had soaked the ground. Mud made movements slow for soldiers and artillery. Napoleon attacked the Allied lines again and again. French cavalry charged bravely, and fierce fighting took place around farms like Hougoumont. The Duke of Wellington's troops held their positions under great pressure. They formed defensive squares to resist cavalry attacks. The fighting lasted all day. Smoke and noise covered the battlefield. In the late afternoon, Napoleon launched a final assault with his Imperial Guard, his most trusted soldiers. It was a desperate attempt to break the enemy line. But at the same time, the Prussian army arrived on the battlefield. They attacked Napoleon's right flank. The French army, already tired and weakened, could not resist both forces. When the Imperial Guard began to retreat, panic spread. The French army collapsed and fled. Napoleon was defeated for the last time. Soon after, he surrendered and was sent into exile on the island of St. Helena, where he would spend the rest of his life. The Battle of Waterloo ended years of war in Europe. It marked the final fall of Napoleon and changed the balance of power on the continent for